Hey everyone, this is Corona once again, back with another video for Monster Hunter World Iceborne. So in today's video, we're going to be continuing the Monster Talk series where I talk about the different monsters that have arrived in Monster Hunter World Iceborne. In my previous episode, I spoke about the subspecies that arrived in Monster Hunter World Iceborne, and that was none other than the Koropoke. If you would like to check out that previous episode, as well as all other previous episodes of the Monster Talk series, I'll go ahead and put a link down in the description below of each and every single episode so you can go ahead and watch them at your own leisure. So with today's video, we're going to be continuing the Monster Talk series by talking about the next monster that we get introduced to in Monster Hunter World Iceborne, as well as the very first veteran monster that we get with this particular expansion, and that is none other than the Barioth itself. The Barioth is a flying wyvern that was first introduced in Monster Hunter Tri for the Nintendo Wii, the very first Monster Hunter game that we got for the third generation of games throughout the Monster Hunter series. Now as a flying wyvern, this particular monster doesn't take on the exact same silhouette and anatomy as that of any of the flying wyverns that we got from the base game, such as the Rathalos itself, for example. In fact, in comparison to the Rathalos, the Barioth itself takes on a very different posture and silhouette in comparison. And overall, this particular monster has such a unique appearance to it that it makes a great addition in the Monster Hunter World Iceborne expansion. Now let's find out as to what makes the Barioth itself such a great addition to the Monster Hunter World expansion. Now to start us off, let's talk about the Barioth's general appearance. The Barioth takes on a snowy white coloration which is contrasted by a number of dark patches across the Barioth's body. Now overall, when it comes to the Barioth's general silhouette and posture and general anatomy, the Barioth itself is actually based on a real life mammal, in this case scenario, a big cat, in comparison to some of the other flying wyverns which are actually based on avian creatures which are meant to be able to fly. So overall, despite the fact that the Barioth itself is a flying wyvern, it's based on a non-flying creature. Now when it comes to the Barioth's overall general appearance, the most unique feature of the Barioth itself is the amber tusk that it has across its face. Now, despite the fact that the Barioth itself is a flying wyvern, it takes on more cat-like appearances in comparison. So when you look at the face of the Barioth itself, it actually looks more akin to that of a big cat such as a snow leopard or even a lion for that matter. So overall, you can already see the difference between the Barioth itself and some of the other flying wyverns that we currently have in the game, such as the Rathalos, for example. Now, the other anatomy features of the Barioth itself is the large plate-like hide that it has running across its back. Now, this is to protect the Barioth itself from certain attacks. So this means that they're not just there for design, they actually do serve a bit of a purpose in that they protect the Barioth itself, because these are areas that are not considered weak points when you actually hit them. So they do serve a bit of a purpose. Now, the Barioth itself is also covered in thick white fur that runs across its underbelly as well as across its wings. And finally, when it comes to the Barioth itself, you will notice that the Barioth itself has large spikes that run across its wings. Now, these spikes actually do serve a purpose in that these spikes actually help stabilize the Barioth's movement when walking through snow and ice in Hoarfrost Reach. And even in combat, they do help stabilize the Barioth itself when it performs certain attacks. So overall, these spikes do serve a purpose. In fact, Capcom themselves actually created the concept art to show how these would work when actually fighting the Barioth itself and when the Barioth moves around. So overall, these do serve a purpose in that they stabilize the monster itself. They're not just there for aesthetic purposes. The fact that Capcom themselves even updated the concept art to show these tiny little details is such an amazing thing that Capcom did when it comes to this particular monster in Monster Hunter World Iceborne. So overall, I think Capcom did a great job of transitioning the monster itself from the previous generation games into Monster Hunter World Iceborne. Now then, shifting from the way this monster looks, let's talk about the way this monster behaves as well as its overall aggression when it comes to Monster Hunter World Iceborne. Now, in terms of the way this monster is represented in Monster Hunter World Iceborne, it's represented as the apex predator of Hoarfrost Reach. Now, having said that, the Barioth itself is not the only apex predator in Hoarfrost Reach itself. The Barioth actually shares this status with the Tigrex or Tigrex, however you want to pronounce it, when it comes to Monster Hunter World Iceborne. This means that despite the fact that the Barioth itself is considered the apex of this particular area, it doesn't necessarily mean it's the only apex when it comes to this particular area, so it is a monster that does share this status with another monster. However, having said that, because the Tigrex itself is actually a monster that roams around different areas in Monster Hunter World Iceborne, the Barioth itself is considered the true apex of this particular area because this is the only monster that is the apex of this particular region. So despite the fact that its status as apex can be challenged by the Tigrex itself, the Barioth is still considered the one true apex of Hoarfrost Reach. Now this means that being the apex predator of Hoarfrost Reach, the Barioth itself is actually quite an aggressive monster. This is one of those monsters where you actually start to see the eye icon indicating that the monster is getting angrier when you are in its line of sight. So overall, you can already see that this monster is actually fairly aggressive. Now having said that though, in comparison to something like the Rajang, the Barioth itself isn't exactly super aggressive in that as soon as it sees you, it engages you in combat. It actually takes a bit of time before the Barioth itself actually engages you in combat. So whilst yes, it is an aggressive monster and it is indeed getting angrier the more you stay in its line of sight, it doesn't do it straight away. It does take a little bit of time before the Barioth itself actually engages you in combat if you stay within its line of sight. So do bear that in mind. You can actually get away from the Barioth itself if you don't want to fight it and just want to stay out of its way. So stay out of its line of sight or don't stay there for too long and you should be just fine. You shouldn't be able to engage it in combat. Now having said that, when the Barioth itself is actually engaged in combat, now this is where the Barioth itself becomes really aggressive as a monster. Now behavioral aggression aside, the Barioth's combat aggression is completely different. The Barioth is a hyper-aggressive monster and rightly so. Now this is one of those monsters that has a number of attack patterns that feel exactly similar, however they have different variations on them, and that's what makes the Barioth such a hyper-aggressive monster. Despite the fact that it uses different variations of the exact same attack, it uses them so efficiently, especially when it becomes really aggressive, such as in rage mode, that it feels like a genuine threat whenever you're fighting this monster because it will continuously bombard you with different attacks. Now when the monster itself is enraged, this is when it becomes really powerful, and in fact, when you fight this monster in tempered mode, it becomes even more powerful in comparison to its standard version. So overall, when it comes to the combat aggression of this particular monster, it is rightly done. When it comes to the Barioth itself, it really shows how aggressive this monster can be, especially when it becomes in rage mode. Because when it becomes enraged, it does combination attacks very similar to that of a subspecies like the Azarathalos, for example. So overall, Capcom themselves have done a great job of keeping this monster such an aggressive monster despite the fact that most of its attacks can be easily read and they're mostly variations of the exact same attack. So it's fairly balanced in the way this monster fights. It has variations of one attack or another, but because of how aggressive it is, the monster itself is very efficient in the way it fights. Now then, let's go ahead and shift into how the Barioth actually fights in Monster Hunter World Iceborne, as well as its overall combat capabilities. Now when it comes to the Barioth itself, the most basic way to describe this monster is that it has an attack that has 3 different variations of it. Now when it comes to the Barioth itself, I say 3 different variations because the Barioth itself will perform a ground variation, an aerial variation, and finally a wall variation of a specific attack. Now the most basic attack that the monster has is the tackle attack. Now when it comes to the tackle attack, the Barioth itself, as previously stated, will perform it in 3 different variations, which is ground, aerial, and a wall variation. Now first up, when it comes to the tackle attack, when it comes to the ground variation, the Barioth itself will simply lunge towards the players using the full weight of its body in order to deal damage to the players. So this is the most basic attack that you will see from the Barioth itself. This is its bog standard ground attack, so this is something that you will see the Barioth perform quite a lot. It's a very basic ground tackle. Now next up, you have the aerial variation of the tackle attack itself. The Barioth itself will nosedive towards the players, very similar to that of a Bazogaze if you look at it, and again, much like that of the ground variation, it will use the full weight of its body in order to deal a significant amount of damage to the players. So if you look at these attacks side by side, you will kind of notice that it's the exact same attack, the Barioth just has a different variation of this particular attack. Now finally, it has a wall variation where the Barioth itself will latch onto a wall and then perform the attack afterwards. Yet again, this is the exact same attack pattern, it has the exact same animation. However, instead of the Barioth itself flying in the air or performing it on the ground, the Barioth itself will latch onto the wall and then perform the attack. So 3 variations of the exact same attack when it comes to the Barioth itself. Now alongside the tackle attack of the Barioth itself, the Barioth also has a breath attack. Now in comparison to some of the other monsters that we have in the game right now, the Barioth's breath attack actually evolves into a tornado after traveling some distance or hitting the ground when performed in the air. This means that the Barioth's breath attack will eventually turn into a tornado very similar to that of the Kushala tornado or even the Behemoth tornado. Now, because the Barioth itself is not considered an Elder Dragon, the tornado itself will disperse much more quickly than that of the Elder Dragons. This means that it actually disappears much more quickly, making it less of a threat in comparison to some of the other monsters that we have in the game that have the tornado effect, which is the Kushala and the Behemoth. Now having said that though, despite the fact that it disperses much more quickly, it does have the ice element on it. This means that if you do get hit by this particular attack, you will have Ice Blight inflicted on you, meaning that your stamina will drain much more quickly than usual. So that is something to watch out for, despite the fact that the tornado itself disperses much more quickly. Now alongside this particular fact, if you are fighting a tempered Barioth, it is worth noting that the Barioth itself will have a much longer tornado time when it is in its tempered form. This means that the tornado of the Barioth itself will linger much longer than that of the standard Barioth itself. It doesn't linger as long as that of the Elder Dragons, but it lingers long enough that it can be considered a threat when you're fighting a tempered Barioth. So that is something to keep a note of when you're actually fighting this monster in its tempered form. Now much like that of the tackle attack itself, the Barioth's breath attack does come in 3 forms: the ground variation, the aerial variation, and of course the wall variation. First up, the ground variation of the Barioth's breath attack is fairly simple. After traveling some distance, the breath attack of the Barioth itself will eventually evolve into a tornado. Now it will either travel some distance before it evolves into a tornado, or it needs to hit the players in order to turn into a tornado, because the impact to the players themselves will cause the Barioth's breath attack to turn into a tornado. Now the second variation of this is the aerial variation. Now the aerial variation of this, it simply needs to hit the ground before it turns into a tornado. So in comparison to the standard version where it travels some distance or it needs to hit a player, it simply needs to hit the ground before it turns into a tornado, meaning that the Barioth itself doesn't need to hit anything other than the ground. Now the final variation of this attack is the wall variation. This means that the Barioth itself will latch onto the wall and then it will perform the breath attack. Much like that of the aerial version, it doesn't need to hit anything else other than the ground before it turns into tornado, meaning that it doesn't need to hit the players directly, it simply needs to hit the ground before it turns into a tornado. So overall, as you can see, when it comes to the breath attack as well, the Barioth itself has 3 variations of the exact same attack, and because of the fact that it's the exact same attack in 3 different variations, this makes the Barioth itself a very efficient fighter when it comes to fighting it directly and using certain attacks. Now as you can see, the Barioth itself is a very efficient fighter. It has 3 variations of certain attacks. Now having said that though, these are not the only attack patterns that the Barioth actually has. The Barioth does have other attack patterns that it can use to fight the players with. First off, it has a tail swipe attack. Now as its name states, the Barioth will simply swipe its tail left or right towards the players, dealing quite a bit of damage to them and actually knocking them down. Now there is a variation of the tail swipe itself which actually nudges the players and deals much less damage to them. However, when it comes to this particular tail swipe, the Barioth itself transitions from the ground into flying in the air. So whilst it doesn't have that much of a damage output and it can't actually knock down the players, it can cause the Barioth itself to transition from the ground into the air. So that is something to keep a note of. Next up, the Barioth itself has a very basic claw swipe attack. Now this is fairly basic yet again. It simply swipes its claw towards the players, dealing quite a bit of damage to them. So that is something to look out for because it is one of those attacks that, depending on the situation, the Barioth can use it to actually abuse you a little bit till eventually you have very little HP and then the Barioth will do a tackle attack afterwards. Now finally, when it comes to the Barioth's other attack patterns, the most unique as well as the most powerful attack pattern that the Barioth has is the pouncing attack. Now this is signified by the Barioth itself posturing itself like an actual big cat and then eventually lunging straight into the air and then pouncing straight towards the players. Now this can deal a heavy amount of damage to the players themselves, especially when the monster is in rage mode. And alongside this, it does have the dangerous property of pinning the players down. This means that the players themselves cannot move away effectively from the monster itself because they're actually pinned down, much like that of how you are getting pinned down by that of a Devil Joe or an Anjanath. So it is something to look out for when you're fighting the Barioth itself, because that dangerous property of pinning you down can really make or break your particular hunt with the Barioth itself. Now when it comes to the pouncing attack, if it doesn't hit you, it does have the effect of tremor on it. This means that if you're not wearing something like the Rocksteady Mantle or you don't have a tremor resistance on you, it can cause the ground to shake, meaning that your character will stagger a little bit, causing your overall movement to be hampered by the Barioth itself despite the fact that it doesn't hit you. So do watch out for this attack. It does have a dangerous property despite the fact that the attack itself doesn't hit you because it hampers your overall movement. Now overall, as you can see with the Barioth itself, it does have a lot of combat capabilities, meaning that it does have a lot of attack patterns that it can use to bombard the players with. However, having said all of that, when it comes to the Barioth itself, it does have one weakness, in that most of these attacks require stability. This means that if the Barioth itself is not stable, the Barioth itself will slip and slide across the ice and snow when it performs these certain attacks. Now the only way to actually make the Barioth slip and slide when performing these attacks is by breaking the spikes on its wings. Now as I previously stated on the way the monster looked, these spikes do serve a purpose, and that is to keep the monster stable when it comes to performing certain attacks as well as traversing the ice and snow of Hoarfrost's Reach. This means that if you actually break these spikes, the stability of the Barioth itself is completely hampered to the point that any attack that it performs, it will actually slip. This means that even the most basic attack, which is the hip check attack, will cause the Barioth to actually slip and stagger, giving you an opening to actually attack the monster with, or even escape from it if you need to. So overall, despite all of these attack patterns, if you actually break the parts of the Barioth itself, this means that the Barioth itself is completely hampered in its stability. Overall, as you can see, this monster is balanced out in this particular manner. It has all of these attack patterns and variations of a certain attack that it can bombard you with, but as soon as you hamper its stability, they don't feel as much of a threat as they would if you don't hamper its stability. This is one of those monsters that is very efficient in the way it fights, but also teaches hunters to be efficient in their own way, in that they have a certain focus that they need to go into in order to actually make the fight go in their favor. So overall, this is a very balanced monster that you get introduced to in Monster Hunter World Iceborne, and rightly so, because this is one of those monsters that teaches you how to be a very efficient hunter when you actually start breaking parts of the monster itself. Now overall, the Barioth itself is a great addition to Monster Hunter World Iceborne, and rightly so. This is a monster that Capcom themselves did a great job of bringing into Monster Hunter World Iceborne. It looks amazing in the graphics of Monster Hunter World, and for the most part, this is a really enjoyable fight. Now there is one flaw when it comes to the Barioth itself that it shares with some of the other monsters in Hoarfrost's Reach, and that is the fact that it is a monster that's not really present in the endgame itself, which is the Guiding Lands. This is because of the fact that there's no snowy region in the Guiding Lands as of this current moment. However, given that Capcom themselves actually added a volcanic region, I am hoping that in the future we do get to have a snowy region where we get to enjoy the Hoarfrost's Reach monsters such as the Barioth itself in the endgame. But other than that, the Barioth itself is a great addition to Monster Hunter World Iceborne and a great introductory veteran for those of you who are starting out in Monster Hunter World when it comes to actually fighting veteran monsters. Now that is pretty much it for me for this video. In my next video, I'm going to be talking about the next veteran monster that we get introduced to in Monster Hunter World Iceborne, as well as the very first flagship monster that we get introduced to throughout the Iceborne expansion, and that is none other than the Nargacuga itself. Until then, if you do enjoy these videos, please feel free to leave a like on the video itself, as well as subscribe to the channel so you can go ahead and catch up on any other videos that I'm going to be making for this particular series. Until then, I hope you enjoyed these videos. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time, onward and upward.